What if everything you were told about success was wrong? What if the people who told you that you needed the right degree, the right family, the right city, the right connections, were simply people who had already given up on their own dreams and needed you to give up on yours too? What if the only thing standing between you and the life you want is not money, not talent, not luck, but the story you keep telling yourself every single morning when you wake up and decide, once again, to wait? That question is not comfortable, and it is not supposed to be, because comfort is exactly what has been keeping you small. And today, that changes. Welcome to English to Inspire, the channel where every story you hear is designed to do two things at the same time: to help you grow your English and to help you grow as a human being. Because we believe that learning a language should not just make you smarter, it should make you stronger, braver, and more alive. If this is your first time here, take one moment right now and subscribe to this channel, because the stories we tell here are the kind that stay with you long after the audio ends. Today, we are going inside the life of a man who had every reason to fail and chose, every single day, to build anyway. His name was Soichiro Honda, and before he became one of the most recognized names on the planet, before his engines powered millions of dreams across every continent, before presidents and engineers and artists admired his name, he was just a small, dirty boy in a tiny village in Japan, the son of a blacksmith. A child who repaired bicycles for a few coins, and who stared at machines the way other children stared at the sky, with a hunger that had no name yet, but that burned with incredible heat and refused to go out no matter how cold the world around him became. He had no university diploma. He had no wealthy father writing checks. He had no mentor in a tall building waiting to give him a chance. What he had was a pair of hands that never stopped moving, a mind that never stopped questioning, and a fire inside his chest that the world would spend decades trying to extinguish without ever coming close to succeeding. And if you are listening to this right now, if you are someone who has been told that you do not have enough, that you did not start in the right place, that your background is too small for your dream, then this story was made specifically for you. Because Soichiro Honda did not come from power. He came from grease and sweat and rejection and rubble. And he turned all of it into something that the world had never seen before. His life is not just a business story. It is a human story. And more importantly, it is a mirror. And if you look into it honestly, you will see something that might surprise you. Because the fire that drove him, that impossible, irrational, unstoppable fire, it is not unique to him. It is inside you too. The only question worth asking today is whether you are brave enough to let it burn. Before there was a Honda motorcycle, before there was a Honda factory, before there was a Honda anything, there was a young man sitting alone in a room full of rejection, holding a piece of metal in his hands that nobody wanted, staring at a future that refused to open its doors, and making a decision that most people in that situation never make, the decision to keep going anyway. Not because it was easy, not because someone encouraged him, not because he could see the finish line, but simply because stopping felt more impossible than continuing. And that single difference in thinking is what separates the people history remembers from the people history forgets. Soichiro Honda left school at a very young age, not because he was lazy, but because the classroom could not contain the speed of what was happening inside his mind. And the real world, with all its noise and grease and mechanical problems, felt more like home to him than any desk ever could. He moved to Tokyo and began working at an auto repair shop called Art Chicago. And those years were not glamorous. They were long and dirty and exhausting, but they gave him something that no school on earth could have given him, which was a deep, intimate, almost physical understanding of how machines worked and why they broke and what they were truly capable of when someone cared enough to push them further than anyone had pushed them before. But then came the rejection that would have destroyed most people. Soichiro had been working on a design for a new type of piston ring, a small but critical engine component, and he was absolutely certain he had something revolutionary. So certain that he invested enormous time and personal resources into his idea, and then walked into Toyota, one of the biggest companies in Japan at the time, ready to show the world what he had built. And Toyota looked at his work and told him no, that his design did not meet their standards, that it was not good enough, and sent him home with nothing but the weight of that word echoing in his chest. A different person would have stopped there. A different person would have taken that rejection as a message from the universe to be realistic, to lower their expectations, to find a safer path, and stop dreaming so loudly. But Soichiro Honda was not a different person. He went back to his workshop, and for 2 more years, working sometimes through the night, sometimes skipping meals, sometimes reaching the edge of what his body could endure, he kept refining, kept testing, kept failing in smaller and smaller ways, until the failure became a solution. And eventually Toyota accepted his piston ring, and that small yes, after so many no answers, became the foundation of everything that came after. The lesson here is not simply about persistence, although persistence is part of it, and the lesson is about what you do with rejection, whether you use it as a wall or a door. Because Honda had a remarkable ability to hear the word no and translate it inside his mind, not as a verdict about his worth, but as a very specific technical problem that still needed solving. And that translation, that refusal to make failure personal, is one of the most powerful skills a human being can develop. And right now, wherever you are, whatever rejection you are carrying in your chest today, the only question that matters is whether you are treating it as the end of your story or as the next problem you are going to solve. There is a moment in every great person's life that nobody talks about enough, and it is not the moment of victory. It is not the speech. It is not the photograph. It is the moment just before all of that, the quiet, almost invisible moment when someone who has been knocked down so many times that the ground feels familiar decides to build something with their own hands, in a small, imperfect space with whatever broken pieces are still available. Not because success is guaranteed, not because anyone is watching, but because the alternative, which is to do nothing, has simply become unacceptable. And that moment, that silent and desperate and beautiful moment, is exactly where Soichiro Honda found himself after the war. But we are getting slightly ahead of the story, because before the war came and changed everything, Soichiro had already taken his first real step toward building something of his own, and that step began in a garage, a small, humble, almost laughable space by any standard, where he set up what he called the Honda Technical Research Institute, which was perhaps the most ambitious name ever given to a room with no investors, no employees, no sophisticated equipment, and no guarantee of anything except the absolute certainty of its founder that something important was about to be created inside those walls. Because certainty like that, the kind that does not need proof from the outside world, is itself a form of fuel. In that garage, Soichiro began working on small engines, studying them, taking them apart, understanding them at a level that went beyond technical knowledge, and entered something closer to intuition. And what drove him was not a business plan or a market analysis, but a purely human obsession. The obsession of someone who has found the one thing in the world that makes time disappear. The one activity during which hunger and fatigue and doubt become background noise, because the work itself is so consuming, so completely alive, that nothing else feels real. And if you have ever experienced even 1 hour of that feeling in your own life, then you already understand exactly what was happening inside that garage. The world outside was complicated and uncertain. Post-war Japan was a country trying to remember who it was. Resources were scarce, materials were difficult to find, and the practical obstacles Soichiro faced every single day would have given any reasonable person more than enough justification to stop. And yet the work continued, because Soichiro Honda operated on a principle that he would later describe in his own words, which was that success is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. And he did not say that as a motivational slogan. He said it as a man who had personally lived inside that 99% 4 years before ever seeing the 1% arrive. What is the garage in your life right now? What is this small, imperfect, unglamorous space where something important is waiting for you to begin? Because most people are waiting for the perfect conditions, the perfect moment, the perfect amount of money or confidence or approval before they allow themselves to start. And Soichiro Honda is proof that the perfect conditions never come first, that the garage always comes before the factory, that the small beginning is not a sign of a small future, but simply the honest and necessary starting point of every large one. And the only question is whether you are willing to start before the world is ready to take you seriously. There are things that happen in a life that no amount of preparation can protect you from. Events so large and so violent and so completely outside your control that when they arrive, they do not just damage what you have built, they erase it. And they force you to stand in the middle of what used to be your work, your effort, your sacrifice, your years, and make a decision about who you are when everything you created is gone. And that decision, made in the ash and the silence and the disbelief, is the truest test of a person's character, because it is easy to be strong when things are going well. But what you do when the ground beneath you disappears is the real measure of everything you claim to believe about yourself. Soichiro Honda built his first piston ring factory in Hamamatsu, and for a time, things were moving forward with a kind of momentum that makes a person believe the hardest part is finally behind them. But then the Second World War arrived and wrapped itself around Japan like a fist, and the military came to Soichiro's factory and told him that his facility would now be used to produce aircraft propellers for the war effort, which meant that his dream, his personal vision, was no longer his own, and the work he was doing was no longer driven by curiosity and passion, but by the cold machinery of a conflict he had not chosen and did not want. And that loss of creative freedom was its own kind of destruction long before the bombs ever fell. And then the bombs fell. American aircraft targeted industrial areas across Japan, and Soichiro's factory was hit, not once, but twice. And the second strike was so devastating that what remained was barely recognizable as a place where human beings had once worked and dreamed, and built things with their hands. And then, as if the bombs were not enough, a powerful earthquake struck the region and finished what the war had started. And Soichiro Honda stood in front of the ruins of everything he had spent years constructing, and faced a moment of such complete and total loss that most people who hear this story today cannot fully imagine what it felt like to be standing in that place at that time with that weight on their shoulders. But here is what Soichiro Honda did. And this is the part of the story that you need to hold inside your chest and not let go of. Because he looked at the rubble, and he made a decision that was almost irrational in its optimism. He decided that the destruction was actually an opportunity. Not because he was naive, not because he did not feel the pain of losing everything, but because he understood something that very few people ever truly learn, which is that a person who has already lost everything has nothing left to be afraid of. And that freedom, the terrifying and electric freedom of having nothing left to protect, can become the most powerful, creative force in a human life if you are brave enough to use it. So let the question land on you now, directly and without softness, because you deserve honesty more than you deserve comfort. And the question is this: what ruins are you standing in right now? And are you treating them as a grave or as a foundation? Because Soichiro Honda looked at destroyed buildings and saw the floor plan of something greater. And the only difference between him and the people who never recovered from their losses is not talent, not luck, not resources. It is the story he chose to tell himself about what the ruble meant. And that story, the one you tell yourself about your own ruins, is entirely and completely and powerfully yours to write. There is something extraordinary that happens to a person who has lost everything and chosen to continue anyway. Something that cannot be bought, or taught, or inherited. And it is a kind of clarity. A sharp and almost ruthless understanding of what truly matters and what does not. Because when you have stood in the ruins of your own work and decided to begin again, you lose your patience for small fears and small excuses and small thinking, and you develop instead an appetite for action that is almost frightening in its intensity. And that is exactly the energy that Soichiro Honda carried into the years after the war. an energy born not from comfort, but from complete and total devastation, which turns out to be one of the most productive places a human being can start from. Post-war Japan was a country in profound pain, a nation that had lost the war and was now trying to survive the peace. And survival in those years was not a metaphor. It was a daily physical reality for millions of people who did not have enough food, enough fuel, enough of anything. And the streets of Japanese cities told the story of that suffering in ways that were impossible to ignore. And it was inside this broken landscape, this world of scarcity and exhaustion and collective grief, that Soichiro Honda saw something that nobody else around him seemed to see, which was not a problem, but an opportunity so obvious and so urgent that he could not understand why everyone else was standing still while he was already moving. He noticed that people needed to move, that the distances between home and work and food and family were real and exhausting, and that there was almost no affordable way to cover those distances with any speed or dignity. And he had in his possession a small collection of army surplus engines, tiny motors that had been used during the war for military radio equipment, and that were now sitting idle and purposeless in a world that had moved on from the conflict that created them. And Soichiro Honda looked at those small engines and then looked at the bicycles that millions of Japanese people were using to move through their broken cities. And he connected two things that nobody had thought to connect before. And in that connection, everything changed. He attached those small engines to bicycles, creating a simple, cheap, and revolutionary form of motorized transportation that ordinary people could actually afford and actually use. And the response was immediate and overwhelming, because he had not built a luxury product for wealthy people. He had built a solution for real people living through a real crisis. And that distinction matters enormously because it reveals something essential about how Soichiro Honda thought, which was always from the ground up, always from the perspective of the person who needs something rather than the person who wants to sell something. And that orientation toward genuine human need is what transformed a simple mechanical idea into the foundation of a global company. The Honda Motor Company was not born in a boardroom. It was not born from a strategy meeting, or an investment presentation, or a moment of calm and calculated planning. It was born from desperation and observation, and the willingness of one man to act on what he saw when everyone around him was too tired or too frightened or too defeated to move. And that origin matters, because it tells you something true and important about where great things actually come from, which is not from perfect conditions, but from imperfect people who refuse to wait for the world to get better before they begin making it better themselves. And right now, in whatever broken landscape you are living in today, the engine that changes everything might already be sitting right in front of you. There is a kind of pride that destroys people. And it is the pride that tells you that asking for help is weakness, that needing someone else is failure, that the truly strong person is the one who does everything alone. And this lie is so deeply embedded in the way many of us think about strength and success that we carry it without even questioning it, letting it cost us years of progress and partnerships and possibilities that we never allowed ourselves to pursue because we confused independence with isolation and called it discipline, when in reality, it was just fear wearing the costume of And Soichiro Honda, a man who seemed in every way like the archetype of the lone genius, understood this truth better than almost anyone around him. Because here is what most people do not know about the Honda story, and it is the part that changes the entire meaning of everything that came before it, which is that Soichiro Honda, for all his brilliance as an engineer, was a deeply impractical man when it came to money and business and the cold, careful world of finance and management. And he knew it. He admitted it openly and without shame, because he had enough self-awareness to understand that knowing what you are bad at is just as valuable as knowing what you are good at, and that the person who pretends to be competent at everything ends up being truly excellent at nothing, which is a trap that ambition sets for talented people with remarkable consistency. In 1949, a man named Takeo Fujisawa entered Soichiro's life, and the meeting of these two human beings was one of those rare collisions that history is built from, because Fujisawa was everything that Soichiro was not. He was calm where Soichiro was explosive. He was financially disciplined, where Soichiro was creatively reckless. He was strategic, where Soichiro was instinctive, and together they formed something that neither of them could have become alone, which is the kind of complete unbalanced force that can actually change an industry rather than simply participating in it. And their partnership would last for more than 20 years and would become one of the most celebrated collaborations in the entire history of business. Soichiro made a decision that required enormous courage, and the courage was not the kind that comes from charging forward, but the kind that comes from stepping back because he agreed to give Fujisawa complete control over the financial and commercial side of Honda while he focused entirely on engineering and product development. And that division of responsibility was not a compromise. It was a strategy, a deliberate and honest acknowledgement that two people operating in their areas of genuine strength will always outperform one brilliant person trying to do everything and succeeding at less than half of it. And the results of that decision would eventually be felt on every continent on the planet. So ask yourself right now, with complete honesty, and without the comfortable shield of pride, who are the people in your life that have strengths where you have weaknesses? And are you allowing them to use those strengths in service of something you are building together? Or are you pushing them away because accepting their contribution feels too much like admitting that you are not enough on your own? Because Soichiro Honda was one of the greatest mechanical minds of the 20th century, and he was not enough on his own. And the moment he accepted that truth was the moment Honda stopped being a small company in Japan and started becoming something the entire world would one day recognize. And that same moment is available to you right now. If you are brave enough to stop pretending you do not need anyone. There is a difference between wanting respect and earning respect. And that difference is not philosophical. It is practical and measurable and visible to everyone around you. Because wanting respect is something you do privately, in your own mind, in the story you tell yourself about how talented you are and how much you deserve and how little the world has given you compared to what you are owed. While earning respect is something entirely different, it is a public act. It is the decision to walk onto the biggest stage available to you and perform at a level that makes argument impossible. And Soichiro Honda understood this distinction, not as a concept, but as a personal mission. And in the mid-1950s, he made a decision that shocked everyone around him and announced to the world exactly who Honda was and what Honda intended to become. He decided to enter the Isle of Man TT race. If you do not know what that is, understand this. The Isle of Man TT is not simply a motorcycle race. It is the most dangerous, most technically demanding, most brutally unforgiving motorcycle race on the planet. A competition held on real public roads, through mountains and villages, where the speeds are extreme and the consequences of failure are fatal. And it had been dominated for decades by the great European manufacturers, the established powers of the motorcycle world, companies with long histories and deep resources, and the kind of institutional confidence that comes from never having been seriously challenged. And when Honda announced its intention to compete, the reaction from the racing world was not fear, it was laughter. The European manufacturers did not see Honda as a threat. They saw Honda as a curiosity, an ambitious little Asian company that did not understand the size of the stage it was trying to walk onto. And that condescension, that comfortable and dismissive laughter, was perhaps the most expensive mistake those companies ever made, because it allowed them to underestimate what was coming. While Soichiro Honda and his engineers were working with a focus and an intensity that the established powers had long since stopped needing. The focus of people who have something to prove and the intelligence to know exactly how to prove it in a way that cannot be questioned or dismissed or explained away. Honda did not win immediately. The first attempts at the Isle of Man were humbling, and there were mechanical failures and strategic mistakes and moments of genuine doubt. But Soichiro Honda treated each failure the same way he had always treated failure, which was as a specific technical problem with a specific technical solution that simply had not been found yet. And his engineering teams worked with a relentlessness that became legendary in the racing world, studying every detail of every breakdown, testing obsessively, refining without pause, and building toward a level of performance that was not just competitive but dominant. And in 1961, Honda achieved something that silenced every voice that had ever laughed at them by winning both the 125cc and 250cc categories at the Isle of Man TT. In a performance so complete that the racing world had no choice but to reorganize its understanding of who belonged at the top. The world stopped laughing that day, and it has never laughed at Honda since. And the lesson inside that moment is so clear and so transferable to your own life that it would be almost dishonest to dress it up in complicated language. So here it is, plainly. Stop asking the people who underestimate you to change their opinion of you. Stop explaining yourself to the people who have already decided what you are capable of. Stop waiting for permission from the world that dismissed you, and instead do what Soichiro Honda did, which is find the biggest stage available to you. Prepare with everything you have. Show up completely. And let the results speak in a language so loud and so undeniable that no one in the room has any words left. There is a particular kind of failure that is more dangerous than ordinary failure. And it is the failure that happens when you are already succeeding. Because ordinary failure is easy to recognize and easy to respond to. It arrives with obvious signals and clear consequences and leaves you with no choice but to change something. But the failure that arrives inside a period of success is subtle and quiet, and dressed in the clothing of a reasonable decision. And it can cost you years before you even realize it happened. And Soichiro Honda experienced exactly this kind of failure when he turned his ambitions toward the largest consumer market in the world, the United States of America, and discovered that the gap between having a great product and understanding the people you are trying to sell it to can be wider than any ocean. When Honda entered the American market in the late 90s, the plan was straightforward and logical, and completely wrong. Because Soichiro and his team assumed that what American consumers wanted was the same thing that had made Honda successful in Japan and in European racing, which was powerful. High-performance motorcycles built for speed and serious riders. And they brought those machines to America with genuine confidence and began trying to sell them through traditional motorcycle dealerships to the traditional motorcycle customer. And the results were deeply disappointing, because the American motorcycle market at that time was dominated by a tough, rebellious culture that had no particular interest in Japanese engineering. And Honda's early sales were slow and discouraging in a way that threatened to end the American adventure before it truly began. But something unexpected was happening at the same time. Something that Honda's small American team noticed almost by accident, which was that the little Honda Super Cubs, the small and quiet and friendly-looking motorcycles that the Honda employees themselves were using to run errands around Los Angeles, because they were cheap and easy to park, were attracting an enormous amount of attention from ordinary people who had never considered owning a motorcycle before. People who found the large and aggressive machines in traditional dealerships frightening, but who looked at the small and approachable Honda Cub and felt something completely different, which was not intimidation but invitation. And that distinction turned out to be worth billions of dollars and a complete transformation of American transportation culture. Honda made the decision to follow what the market was actually telling them rather than what their original plan had assumed, and they began marketing the Super Cub not through motorcycle dealerships, but through sporting goods stores and hardware shops, reaching an entirely new category of customer with a now legendary advertising campaign built around the phrase, "You meet the nicest people on a Honda," which deliberately and brilliantly separated the Honda motorcycle from the rebellious outlaw image that had defined the American motorcycle world and replaced it with something warm and accessible and completely new. And the response from the American public was so powerful and so immediate that it did not just save Honda's American operation. It permanently changed the way America thought about motorcycles and about Japanese manufacturing. The lesson here is one that Soichiro Honda lived before he ever articulated it. And it is the lesson that your plan B can be greater than your plan A. That the thing you discovered by accident while pursuing your original intention can turn out to be more valuable than the intention itself. And that the willingness to listen to what reality is actually telling you rather than defending what you originally believed is not weakness or inconsistency, but one of the highest forms of intelligence available to a human being. And right now, in your own life, and your own work, and your own relationships. There are signals around you that are trying to tell you something important, and the only question is whether you are too attached to your original plan to hear them. There is a version of Soichiro Honda that the world loves to present, and it is the version of the visionary genius, the unstoppable force of nature, the man who never doubted and never wavered and moved through life with the certainty of someone who could see the future clearly, while everyone else was still trying to understand the present. And that version is inspiring in its own way, but it is also incomplete. And in its incompleteness, it is actually less useful to you than the truth. Because the truth about Soichiro Honda is that he was a deeply, magnificently, almost spectacularly flawed human being. And it is precisely those flaws, and what he did with them, that make his life worth studying with the kind of honesty that goes beyond admiration and enters something closer to recognition. Soichiro Honda was impulsive in a way that frequently terrified the people around him, making decisions at speed when the situation seemed to call for patience, expressing his emotions with a directness that sometimes crossed the line into aggression, throwing objects in frustration when his engineers could not achieve what he believed was possible, arriving at work covered in grease and oil while other executives wore suits, refusing to behave according to the social conventions that Japanese business culture of his era demanded, and doing all of this, not out of disrespect for the people around him, but out of a complete and total inability to pretend that he was something other than exactly what he was, which was a man entirely consumed by his passion and entirely unwilling to perform a version of himself that felt false. And he was honest about his failures in a way that was almost uncomfortable to witness. Because in a culture and an era where admitting weakness was seen as deeply shameful, Soichiro Honda spoke openly about the things he did not know, the mistakes he had made, the decisions he regretted, and the limitations he had learned to work around rather than pretend it did not exist. And this honesty was not a public relations strategy. It was not a carefully calculated display of humility designed to make people like him more. It was simply the expression of a man who had spent so much of his life failing and learning from failure that he had lost his fear of admitting it. And in losing that fear, he had gained something that most successful people never find, which was the freedom to keep learning without the burden of defending a perfect image. His philosophy on work was built on a foundation that sounds simple but is almost impossible to actually live. And it was the belief that 100% of success comes from embracing the full reality of your situation, including the painful parts, the embarrassing parts, the parts that reveal your ignorance and your weakness and your distance from where you want to be. Because the person who cannot face those parts clearly will always be working with incomplete information about themselves, and will therefore always be solving the wrong problems. And Soichiro Honda spent his entire life solving the right problems because he was willing to see himself and his work with a clarity that was sometimes brutal, but always useful. He once said that success can only be achieved through repeated failure and introspection, and that in fact success represents 1% of your work, which results only from the 99% that is called failure. And when you hear those words, you must resist the temptation to nod politely and move on as if you have understood them, because truly understanding them means accepting something that most people spend their entire lives running from, which is that the failures you are experiencing right now, the ones that embarrass you and exhaust you and make you question everything, are not interruptions to your progress, but the actual substance of it, and the person you are becoming inside those failures, if you are paying attention and staying honest, is already more powerful than the person you were before they began. Soichiro Honda died on August 5th, 1991, at the age of 84. And when he left this world, he left behind something that no obituary could fully measure. Not the factories, not the patents, not the billions of dollars, not the racing trophies, not the millions of engines running in millions of vehicles across every continent on the planet, but something quieter and more important than all of that, which was a proof, a living and breathing and undeniable proof that a boy with no money and no diploma and no connections and no advantages and no permission from anyone could look at a broken world and decide to build something beautiful inside it. And that proof does not belong to Soichiro Honda alone. It belongs to every human being who has ever stood at the beginning of something difficult and wondered whether they had what it takes to reach the end. But here's what you need to understand about that proof. And this is the part where honesty requires me to stop talking about Soichiro Honda and start talking directly about you, because his story is finished and yours is not. And the distance between those two facts is the most important thing in this entire narration, because Soichiro Honda cannot build anything more. He gave everything he had to the world, and the world received it, and now his work is done. But your work is not done. And in fact, for many of you listening right now, your real work has not even properly begun. And that is not a criticism. It is an invitation. But it is an invitation with an expiration date. And that date is closer than you think. You have been listening to this story for 40 minutes. And in those 40 minutes, something has happened in the world outside your headphones. Opportunities have moved. Time has passed. The gap between where you are and where you want to be has either grown smaller because you were already moving before you pressed play, or it has stayed exactly the same size because listening to inspiring stories has become a way of feeling productive without actually producing anything. And only you know which of those two things is true. And only you can decide which one will be true tomorrow morning when you wake up, and the audio is finished, and the silence arrives, and the only voice left is the one inside, your own head telling you what to do next. Soichiro Honda did not wait for the world to be ready. He did not wait for the bombs to stop falling before he started thinking about what he would build in the rubble. He did not wait for Toyota to say yes before he kept refining his piston rings. He did not wait for the American market to make sense before he followed what reality was showing him. He did not wait for the racing world to respect him before he showed up at the Isle of Man and earned that respect in a way that could never be taken back. He did not wait. He never waited. And the engine of everything he built, the real engine, the one that had nothing to do with metal or fuel, was simply that. The absolute refusal to wait for conditions that would never be perfect, and permission that would never come. So here is where this story ends, and here is where yours must begin, or continue, or accelerate, because the world does not need another person who knows the story of Soichiro Honda. The world needs the thing that his story is pointing at, which is you, fully committed, fully honest about your weaknesses, fully willing to fail in public and learn in the ruble, and begin again without waiting for applause. The world needs your engine running at full power. And the world has been waiting long enough. And you have been waiting long enough. And the only thing left to do now is exactly what that small boy in a Japanese village did when he first felt the fire in his chest and had no map and no guarantee and no safety net. Which is to begin right now, today, with whatever broken and imperfect pieces are available to you. Because the engine inside you is already built, and it has been waiting for you to start it. And there is no reason left to wait.